morning and welcome to our Friday morning lecture series, Remarkable Revisions. Our lecture today, Behind the Picture, I'm so nervous, sorry. Behind the Picture, looking in depth at paintings from the Spanish and Italian collections of the San Diego Museum of Art, will be given by Nigel McGilchrist. And surely many of you remember with fondness past talks given by him in this auditorium. Nigel was a scholar both at Winchester College and at Oxford University, where he graduated with a first-class degree and won 3 university prizes and medals in literature and art history. He has lived and volunteered in the Mediterranean area, Italy, Greece, and Turkey for over 30 years, and was working initially for the Italian Ministry of Art in the field of wall painting conservation. He taught first at Rome University, then in Athens, and subsequently at the University of Massachusetts. He was for 8 years dean of the European Studies Program for a consortium of American universities. For 6 years, he walked in every path and village of the 60 inhabited Greek islands, preparing the most detailed existing survey guide of their archaeology, history, and art. It was published in abbreviated forms as the Blue Guide to Ancient Islands and in a complete version as the 20 volumes of McGilchrist's Greek Islands. He lectures widely in art and archaeology at museums and institutions in Europe and the United States, and today we are so lucky that we are his audience. He currently lives near Oviedo in Italy and produces olive oil and red wine. Please join me in welcoming back Nigel to our museum.
Thank you very much, Monica, for those kind words of introduction, and thank you, docents generally, for funding and for the sponsors who are funding this talk and have invited me here. Ruth Browdy, who's organized this, Monica, who got me here to come here in the first place. And a particular thank you to Harvey Warren, one of the docents whose images I'm immensely indebted to. Most of the images, the really good ones of the pictures we're looking at, have been taken by him. So all of you, thank you very, very much. It's a great pleasure to be back here in San Diego after a pause of about 5 or 6 years, I think it is. I first came, I think, in 1995. And gave a talk in this auditorium. I can't remember what it was about. I remember there were some images of Syria and Palmyra in it, but I can't remember what the subject was at all. But ever since then, that was the beginning of a kind of romance for me with San Diego. I mean, it was particularly nice then because I was working in central Tennessee during the winter. And to come from a sort of ice-bound mountaintop in Tennessee to San Diego was a huge pleasure, and it's been a huge pleasure ever since to come back to this city. It's a wonderful city. You don't need telling that because you know it, and that's why you live here. But it's a great pleasure to be back again. Thank you very much. And the question for me was simply what to talk about. We could have talked about lots of things. We could have done a sort of crash course in 20 volumes of the Greek islands. But I thought the nicest thing to do would be to talk about your own collection because it's familiar to you. Many of you work with it, who are docents. Many of you who are patrons of the museum support it. The crucial thing is it's a wonderful collection. I mean, you have, certainly in the area that particularly interests me, which is the Renaissance period. I mean, you have a wonderful collection here. I mean, very, very good. You also have a marvelous curator at the moment, a very scholarly and excellent curator who is in the process of preparing a sort of catalogue raisonné of a lot of the Renaissance paintings. And so maybe some of the comments that I have to make about those paintings will need revising in the light of his scholarship and what he has to say. But as a tribute to the lovely collection that you have, I thought it would be nice to talk about that. And I know it's familiar to you, but maybe we can shed some new light just occasionally on pictures which you're familiar with. I'm going to be talking mostly about a very crucial period in the history of art, which we generally call the Renaissance. In other words, the sort of late 1400s, the early 1500s. That's going to be mostly where my paintings are, some of them a little bit later, as you'll see. But I'm going to talk about 11 paintings, most of them very familiar to you. But before looking at any of the paintings, it's worth saying, I think, three things which I think help people to understand what is actually quite a distant period of history. I mean, we're talking about 500 years ago. The world has changed an awful lot since then. And I think if you bear these three things in mind, it makes it easier to look at painting of this period. I think the most important adjustment we need to make is to remember that in the period that we're talking about, in the 1500s or the late 1400s, the ordinary citizenry, like you and me, probably only saw 2 or 3 paintings in their whole lifetime, if they were lucky. I mean, we move an awful lot. People didn't then. I mean, most people never went more than about 5 miles radius from where they were born and where they eventually died. Some people, scholars, priests, diplomats, travelled further, and they got the chance to see a few more paintings. But for the average citizen, a merchant, if he was a lucky merchant and lived in a city like Venice or Florence, then he saw quite a few paintings in his lifetime. But most people only saw a few. Anyway, a handful, let's say, nothing like the sort of millions of images that we see, the hundreds of pictures we see when we go into a gallery, reproductions in books, magazines, and all the rest. And I think it's an important obligation that we have towards painting of this period, is to give it the attention that people then gave it. I mean, think what it was like to see a painting when you only saw a few in your whole lifetime. It was a really important occasion. And so you would look at it in depth, and you would think about all aspects of it, not just the visual design, but also the meaning of it, how the artist did it, all these kind of things. And of course, that led to conversation, discussion in a world before entertainment. There were no really theatres to talk about. There was no cinema, there was no television, books were hard to come by. So when there was a painting, it was a talking point. It was something that people would endlessly dilate upon and talk about and exchange ideas. So I think we need to remember that, paintings are profound things and were sort of, their relationship to them was very different from ours. Okay, point number one. The second thing sort of leads from that, and I can't remember what the second point is. I'm going to have my Mark Rubio moment and take a glass of water, which I've got close here. I don't have to lunge off to the side in order to get it. My second point relates very closely to that, and it's so important that it's completely fled my mind. Anyway, the third point, let's come on to that. It'll come back to me in a moment. The third point is a technical one. Those of you who do any painting will know that one of the first big adjustments that you make when you create an image in 2 dimensions from the world that you see in 3 dimensions is that you have to start cutting. You have to start editing what you see. You really have to cut down not only the details of what you see, but also the colours. I mean, in the world we see a huge number of colours. And when you paint, a small area in 2 dimensions can only sustain really about 3 principal colours. I say 3 because if you go up to the gallery upstairs, you'll notice that if you ask yourself, what are the principal colours in this painting that the painter is working with? It's normally 2 or 3. Sometimes it's more. If you think of the painting by Vincenzo Catena, there are more colours in it. But ask yourself when you look at that painting, is there actually a little too much colour? Are the colours actually rather competing, and is it distracting my eye? The artist needs to make you focus, and the artist can make you focus by reducing the number of colours, harmonising them, and bringing them down to about a number of 2 or 3. And you'll see this in the paintings that I'm talking about. So a very important aspect of art is preparing it for the eye of the beholder, by editing out a lot of distracting information which is there in reality, and a lot of different colours, and bringing it down to about 2 or 3. We'll see, the more you reduce the colour, the greater the power of the colour in the painting. And that's a sort of theme that I want you to think about when looking at these paintings. And I just put on the screen to begin with, I was in the Botanical Gardens just a moment ago, the building adjacent, and they have this lovely, lovely orchid display. It's not a very good photograph, but it was taken with my telephone. But there we are, the great sort of variety of colours of orchids. Obviously beautifully made there by the botanical department and to show off all the varieties. But nature would never do that. Nature would never put so many varied colours all together. And in a way, the effect of the colours is lost by the fact that there's really too many of them and they're competing. And that's precisely what I mean about these paintings that we're going to be looking at. The artist needs to remember this. And those of you who are painters will know this. When you start to paint a landscape, you see all kinds of colours. But the important thing as a painter is to remember to reduce those colours a lot. And if you look at the great landscape painters, people like Constable, you notice that it's all the variety of greens and browns, and then there's a little important dot or two of red which lifts it up. It's a reconstruction. It's not a depiction, of course, of reality. Whereas if you look at actually a single flower like that, then you come back to a constant. Nature is wonderful at its handling of colour. I mean, look how beautiful, just the 3 colours involved in that, the white, the dark red and the yellow right in the heart of the flower. And those colours really introduced me to this painting because they're the same colours that you see in this lovely painting by Crivelli, which at the moment is in a separate gallery upstairs because it's been put in juxtaposition with a fascinating modern contemporary painting by a Hispanic artist. This is work by Crivelli, and it dates from the 1480s, 1460s, late 1460s, I think. A Madonna and Child. Very, very stylish and very stylized as a painter. Notice the calmness of the colours. I mean, we've just got really, it's a play on 2 colours, really. The beautiful red, that sort of carmine red of the gown, of the sleeves of her tunic and the curtain behind, and a little bit of green of the underside there. There's green and red. And then the blue and the whites, these are rather neutral colours anyway. So it's really the thing that strikes your eyes, those 2 colours of blue and green, which are obviously complementary colours. But it's an interesting intellectual game going on in this painting, because where is the sort of border of reality here? There's a parapet in the foreground, which sort of ostensibly divides us from the viewers, from the Virgin and Child. But the Virgin is behind it, but the Child is on it. So he's in an intermediary sort of position, as it were, between our world and the world of the Virgin. And the play is, the sort of intellectual play is further enhanced by the presence of that little sealed letter, bottom right, down there, which is painted on beautifully, illusionistically. I mean, this is partly humorous little touch, but it's also it's a conversation piece. I was saying before, if you only see one or 2 paintings in a lifetime, then it's important to be able to have things to talk about and to discuss and to question about a painting. And then, of course, there's the magnificent fruits up at the top. We'll come on to those in a moment. But this idea of sort of a picture as, is it a picture or is it reality? In other words, playing with the illusion of reality and picture is a very, very common thing in this particular period, at the end of the 1400s. And particularly in the city where Crivelli earned his stripes as a painter, which was, though he was born in Venice, he did most of his painting work in the city nearby of Padua, which is, of course, the home of the oldest university, the most prestigious university in Renaissance Europe, Padua University. Therefore, a world of intellectuals and people whose response to painting would have been far more intellectual and discursive and inquisitive than elsewhere. And other painters who worked in that area, this is an image you may not be familiar with. This is a wonderful painting in the National Gallery of Scotland in Edinburgh. And it's by an unknown Ferrarese painter. Ferrara is very close to Padua. But this is a sort of ultimate illusion, because you'll see there's all this broken paper around the edge, as if the painting has been sort of unwrapped. The painting was sort of covered, as it were, and then it's suddenly been sort of blown apart for some reason, and this very stylized Virgin and Child again, with the two angels, these rather etiolated angels, appears. So what is our relation to them? It's like a puzzle. I mean, puzzles have always been a pleasure to people, and in a world, to remind you again, without television, without theatre, these puzzles were an important sort of part of passing the time and of entertainment. And probably, if you notice just there, where the little red bottom left, you can't actually see it in this slide very well, but there's a wee fly there, a little blue bottle. So I say he's a wee fly because this is in the National Gallery of Scotland. So there he is down there, increasing the sort of sense of illusion, because that bit of the paper that's been ripped off there in order to reveal this scene, as if through a frame of a picture, but it's in the picture. That's very, very odd. The illusion is enhanced by a fly. And that fly, of course, reminds us of another great painting by Crivelli, the same painter that we began by looking at. And this is in the Metropolitan Museum in New York, because, lo and behold, the little Christ child there, holding the goldfinch, which we'll talk about in a moment, is staring fixedly at this blue bottle which has landed on the surface of the painting, but is in the painting, of course, symbol of evil, the sort of kind of presence of the devil, maybe, that Jesus has come into the world to deal with. That's his mission, and he's looking at it very, very carefully. In translating images, one has to be very careful. It's not an cast iron thing. It's not that fly equals evil, the devil. But it should make you think, why is the fly there? Why has he put it there? This is part of the painting, as it were, substituting what for us, cinema and theatre and these kind of entertainments do for us. It's part of the talking point of the picture. And this rather sort of conspicuous cluster of fruits hanging up there is also part of this. It's not that each fruit has a particular meaning, but they should ring bells for you. The sort of painting should be, in a way, sort of musical. It should ring bells for you. And this is where, we realize that we live in a different world. I mean, some of you may be very familiar with biblical scripture and writing. Some of you less so. But to a predominantly Christian world, like 15th century northern Italy, the presence there, for example, apples. Okay, we can understand that. We know about apples, particularly in the book of Genesis, the apple that Eve took from the tree of knowledge, because Mary was often seen as the new Eve, the person who had to undo what Eve did. In other words, by bringing into the world her son, who takes away the evil that came with the apple. So, that obviously has a very clear thing there. But why a hanging cucumber? Or gherkin, or whatever you want to call it. Do you call them gherkins in the States? I can't remember. They're sort of pickled cucumbers. It's an odd thing to hang in a picture next to the Virgin Mary. Why hang up a gherkin? Well, again, this is to do with bells ringing. You have to remember that to a well-read in Scripture society, they remembered the story of Jonah. And the story of Jonah was very important because it was like a kind of proto-story of Jesus. Because Jonah was a good man, and he was thrown overboard as a sacrifice to the people who were worried about the ship going down. Do you remember the story? Then he was thrown overboard because he was considered, a sort of sacrifice, and that way the storm would go down and the others on the boat would be saved. And a whale swallowed him. He spent 3 days in the belly of the whale, the Bible tells us, and then he was regurgitated. So it was a natural sort of image of Christ, the sacrifice, the crucifixion, being thrown overboard, 3 days in which Christ is supposed to have descended into hell, harrowed hell, and then on the third day rose again, was vomited out by the whale. Now, the Bible, the book of Job, then says, the book of Jonah, the Bible says about Jonah that he was thrown up by the whale, regurgitated from the sort of intestines of the whale, onto a strand, and reposed under a trellis of cucumbers. So there is Jonah after his terrible sort of trials, reclining under a trellis of cucumbers, or it's variously translated the Hebrew word as sort of cucumbers as gourds, but the same family, this curious family of things there. So, these are part of the symbolic story that lies behind the painting. But you can see, we said that Crivelli worked in Padua. Padua was also where the greatest early Renaissance sculptor from Florence, Donatello, came and worked for a while and had a huge influence. He was a very, very important artist. He left great influence wherever, and a great impression wherever he went. And that sculptural quality comes into the paintings of Crivelli in this Paduan period. I mean, look at the little child and the Virgin Mary. They're like sort of marble sculptures put in painting. You can see that influence very much, quite hard, quite haughty, quite superior, not necessarily soft immediately, but very easily recognizable. He's a marvelous painter. And the illusionism, I mean, notice the parapet there. Oh yes, a crack in the parapet. The crack. Notice it's a classical parapet there. It's a bit of sort of classical, ancient sort of architrave. That's the crack that is appearing in the ancient world, in the pagan world, brought about by the birth of the Redeemer. So every element, in the painting speaks at one level to people who would hear, and in those days, of course, they did. And we just need to sort of relearn this way of looking at things. Oops. Well, I just want to talk about the fruit here, because it's a little less prominent. We've got an apple up there. We've got 2 apples, or have we got 2 apples? Just look at the difference between, that one's an apple, okay. I don't generally recognize apples that shape. Slightly different. That's a quince, actually. Let's have a look at it close to. There it is, a quince. What was the quince? This is interesting, because the quince was the vegetable in pagan times that was sacred to the goddess of love and fertility, and was a symbol because it shaped the quince like a woman who is pregnant. It has a swollen womb, as it were, swollen belly. It was the symbol of the fertility and of giving birth. And that's what it meant in antiquity. And it comes through into the Middle Ages as well. And still in the area of Croatia and Dalmatia, on the opposite Adriatic coast from Venice, but an area in which Crivelli, this painter, worked for some of his life. In that area, it's the tradition to plant a quince tree when a child is born, as a giving of thanks. It's just a symbolic giving of thanks. It's a lovely thing to do. There's such beautiful trees, quinces. There's a wonderful blossom. It smells very beautiful, and there's lovely fruit and beautiful leaves. A quince tree is planted still to this day in that part of the world. It's a tradition for Thanksgiving, for the safe birth of a child. So it's nice that in our Crivelli picture we have not just an apple, but we have also a quince, talking about another aspect of the central story of the Virgin and Child. I mean, this is a way in which a painter makes a story which, after all, is incredibly repeated. And, when you think of Christian art, it consists of endless crucifixions and endless Madonnas and Childs. So the question is, how do you make your one different? How do you make it more interesting? How do you make it, how do you make it speak in a different way? I mean, I'm not wishing to in any way diminish Christian art by saying that it repeats these same themes. I mean, they are fundamental themes. There is no greater theme, image of the cruelty of man to man than the sight of a man crucified. by his peers. So it's an ultimate image of the cruelty of man to man, and the Virgin and Child is the ultimate image of love and goodness, the greatest love that we know in life, which is the love of a mother for her child. Well, there's the baby, very, very memorably Crivelli. Look at that design. You can see there, this is a tempera painting. I'm going to modify that comment in just a moment. I say it's a tempera painting. Those of you who were in the docents class that were watching my demonstration yesterday will understand the significance of that. But those little tiny hatching strokes, as if they're almost like etching or done with a pencil, the drawing, that's very typical of tempera work, because tempera is a dry medium. What we mean is mixing pigments and water and egg yolk, and it dries as quickly as ink. So you can't blend colours at all. So you do little hatching strokes like that. So this is a tempera painting. You can see it in the face there. You can see it everywhere, little hatching strokes. But I just wanted to draw your attention to this lovely pearl necklace as well that the child is wearing, another element. And, in Crivelli, never take anything for granted. It always has a reason. The little brooch in the centre is coral. This was always hung around the centre, around the neck of a child. Coral since ancient times, since Egyptian times. And all through ancient Greece and ancient Rome was considered something which turned away evil and therefore was traditionally hung around the neck of a baby. So here it is a little actual brooch. But of course the pearl itself is another wonderful, if I could say, pregnant image. It's full of all kinds of significance. It, naturally means purity, but it's something that is born within a shell and is the product of the mother, the mollusk, as it were. So it's a wonderful symbol of the product of the womb, of birth, and it's a symbol of purity. And royalty and clarity and truthfulness, all the things that, to the Christian viewer of this painting, Jesus himself symbolized. So the lovely, even though beautiful images and designs, these paintings, and he's a master designer, Crivelli, they are paintings that are full of all kinds of other things that you can read at different levels. And I said a moment ago it was a tempera painting, and you'll see the actual little note by the painting upstairs in the gallery says oil and tempera. Because in this period, the late 1400s, artists are in a ferment of experimentation. And they're trying to find new ways of painting, new ways principally of making this rather difficult, demanding medium of painting in tempera, mixing pigments with water and egg yolk, which takes a lot of preparation and is very, very difficult to handle because it dries immediately. They're trying to find ways of lengthening the drying time by mixing oil and trying to get that to work, but the oil doesn't dry, so they have to find some means of adding a dryer, and then they put resin in, and they create new experiments of ways of painting. For the first time in the history of painting, this happens. And you can document it wonderfully by reading the notebooks of Leonardo, which are fascinating on all accounts, because he's talking about science and politics and geography and everything, but he talks also about his experiments. He said, today, I experimented with squishing garlic and trying to paint with the sticky stuff that came out of it. And, he tries every possibility, every way of finding new things to paint with. And the artists are they're groping their way, as it were, slowly towards a new kind of painting, which is more elastic literally, physically, and more elastic in time, which is oil painting, and which can create new effects. And this is basically a tempera painting, but the oil is present in this lovely diaphanous little underveil there, which the Virgin is wearing. And the slide here, the picture, though wonderful, and I'm very grateful to Harvey for this marvellous image, just look at the painting itself. That really gives you, you can see the difference of the oil painting there. Okay, well, let's look at it. And a painter who's working exactly at the same time as Crivelli, Giovanni Bellini, in Venice, who is the single greatest practitioner at this particular moment in the late 1400s of oil painting. He and Antonello of Messina. And notice how the lines which define the face have been completely dissolved now in this new medium. See, if you're painting in a dry medium, tempera, with the egg yolk and the water, it's like painting with a fountain pen with ink, or with a pen or a pencil. In other words, there's no moisture there, there's no movement, there's no possibility to blend. As soon as you master the business of painting in egg and oil and varnish, which is what he's doing, a mixture of them all, then suddenly the lines which define, let's just go back and look at, you see there's a clear line, drawn line around her face. That's what gives it its sculptural quality, makes it look like marble. As soon as we come to the Bellini, the edge is becoming ambiguous. It's much more like how I perceive your faces here in this light, as it were, illuminated. It's in a way, it's softer and more expressive and more naturalistic. And an extraordinary, it's a marvelous painting. This is in the Accademia in Venice. And I was working there the other day and took this picture. This is again with my telephone. That's why probably the focus is not that good. And look at that lovely child's face, quite different from Crivelli's. So there's a lot of experimentation going on in Italy at this time. And just to introduce another painter who is upstairs at, again, exactly the same period in the same area, this time actually in the town of Ferrara. Those of you who know the north of Italy will know that Venice is half an hour from Padua and Ferrara is half an hour from Padua. So, it's like going from here to San Clemente. Or even closer. No distance at all. This painter, Cosimo Tura, is painting in another entirely different way. He's also, to some extent, experimenting with tempera and oil mixture, but he's still basically a tempera painter. Look at those clear outlines. He's a very gnarled painter. By gnarled, I mean Gnarled. He looks like that baby looks like a log of olive wood with all its knots and sort of bumps in it. There's something sort of fierce and manic about him. He's a very interesting painter, but quite hard. Nothing soft. Could just compare it with the softness of Bellini. Bellini is he's a cuddlesome painter. Not so Cosimo Tura, but a wonderfully memorable. Once you've seen a painting by Tura, you never forget it. And these bright tempera colors that he's working with here. Now here he really is pushing the limits of how much color you can put in a painting. Look at that sort of strong lapis blue and then the coral pink and then the green, the malachite green. Still only 3 colors, but they're very, very strong and they're competing with one another as each one of these figures in the picture are competing for attention from us all the time. Well, he's, of course, the painter of this lovely little portrait upstairs in the gallery of St. George. In fact, this image of St. George is part of a left-hand panel of that altarpiece. This is in London in the National Gallery. It's the central panel of the Virgin and Child with the angels playing music. Originally, it would have had a wing to the left, and on that wing was St. George, a full-length figure. He's now been truncated and cut in half, unfortunately. And again, you see the tempera there, tempera lines, the underdrawing, the little tiny, tiny strokes, the hard lines, which it's very, very sensitive, this thing. The hard lines which define the face. Now, let's just look at how portraiture and the way the face is depicted changes with this revolution that I mentioned in painting techniques. In other words, in this passage from a difficult, dry, draftsman-like method of painting with egg yolk and water and pigment to this much more fluid and flexible method of oil painting. So here we are, pure tempera. This wing is actually, there is no oil in this painting at all, even if there was in the center of the central panel I showed you a moment ago. All these lovely effects, like the effects of the shine on the armor, beautifully, beautifully done. He's a very fine painter. This banner here, this little sort of medal that he's wearing, red, white and green, has been added later, and I'm not quite sure why. If you sort of get down below the painting and sort of look up, you catch the light like that, you can see that it's slightly raised, it's higher. It's been added at a later stage, and probably to do with somebody who owned the painting at a later stage, and that was their heraldic colours. And the mention of heraldry, of course, makes one realise that actually Cosimo Tura is a very heraldic painter. This is a very heraldic St. George, with his sort of very clear-cut face and form. Well, only a generation later, when this technique of oil has been properly understood and comes into the hands of really master painters who are master experimenters like Giorgione, and this is, of course, the treasure of your Renaissance gallery, then that dissolving of the outlines that we saw with the Bellini painting a moment ago is taken a step further with Giorgione. Now, notice this in this painting, the eyes connect with you immediately. I mean, you make eye contact with the sitter. We don't know who it is, as opposed to George, who is, of course, looking into the distance. It's rare that in early paintings eye contact is made with you. But as part of the sort of package of the Renaissance and the change of status of the artist and of our relationship, our sense of our relationship to God, which changed in the Renaissance, this exploration of psychology and the interpersonal relationship between a sitter and the viewer begins to make its first appearance. And it's interesting, I don't know why it is. I think it may be to do with the hemispheres of the brain or whatever. I don't know what the reason is. But we instantly notice that the vast majority of portraits are angled like this. In other words, they look in that direction. Notice how St. George was looking the other direction. Okay, well, he was on the left-hand panel, so he had to look in that direction. But it's extraordinary that you do get portraits of people from that side, but you mostly get portraits of this angle of the face. I mean, just notice it as we go through or as you go through the galleries there. You'll always get that particular angle of the face. And this is your greatest Renaissance painting. Just to talk about something completely different to do with this, there are problems with this painting. It's a very complex painting because X-ray has shown that it has a painting on the back of it. It has drawings underneath it. This was fairly common in the case of Giorgione. But it's a painting which has very little provenance. In other words, we only hear about it for the first time as being referred to in a collection of somebody we don't know who he was. We know his name, but we don't know anything more about him, in England in the 19th century. And the first time it ever appeared in published literature was 1937. So when you get a painting which purports to be by one of the great painters of the Venetian Renaissance, and you don't have a provenance, you can't trace where the painting has been, you could start to think sort of, is this really what it is, or is it something that's been created much later? That's what you feel when you have a problem of no provenance like that. I mean, for a curator, it'll be very interesting to see what John Machari has to say about this, because he's a scholar of provenance, and of course the question of provenance is very, very important. If you don't have a provenance, then you've got to work much harder to convince yourself and your public that this really is a genuine Giorgione. You have to go to the stylistic qualities of it. And to me, I have no doubt about this. I have never felt that this was anything other than what it purports to be. It is, to me, a Giorgione, because there is something extraordinarily... in the ambiguity of it, in the hesitancy of the eyes, the hesitancy of the outlines, it is perfectly Giorgione. He was a very hesitant painter. He doesn't have the confidence of his fellow student, Titian. Giorgione, of course, died much younger. He died of the plague as a young man. Titian went on into his 90s to paint and had a prolific output. They were both students of Bellini, which we saw a moment ago. But there is a tentative quality and a hesitant quality which comes out in this furtive way that the figure looks at us. And of course, it's a painting that's had a physical history which is problematic. Again, infrared photography shows that probably he originally had a hat on his head. And then at some point the painter, we think the painter, or maybe somebody later, but probably the painter himself decided to take that off and just have him bareheaded with this magnificently defined hair here. Beautiful. That's the first time in the history of art that you see hair as delicately conceived as that. If we were to go back to the Bellini, it's much more defined, even though it's already beginning to become a little more ambiguous. But this is really remarkable hair. And of course, his gown actually originally had a purple velour sort of quality to it, and that has gone with cleaning. One of the problems when paintings are cleaned is that often in the 19th century or the 20th century, when cleaning was not very not very well done, is that these subtler effects were removed. And so the lovely purple, which would have balanced beautifully that green, because green and purple again are complementary colours, would have enhanced the painting enormously. But that's gone now. Wonderful. It'd be very interesting to see what your curator has to say about that gap in the provenance. And of course, this is a painting like most of the paintings that I'm talking about, which is I think it was the gift of the Putnam sisters, who weren't, of course, buying for them. Anne and Amy Putnam weren't buying for themselves. They were buying for the city of San Diego for a public collection. And it's a tribute to their extraordinary generosity that they were able to get hold of such marvellous paintings. Notice the angle of the face, again, the same, looking across like that, but making eye contact. Sebastiano del Piombo, just a sort of generation younger than Giorgione, a painter who also worked together with Titian in Venice, came from up there, was called Sebastiano del Piombo, Sebastian of the lead, because he was master of the lead seals at one point in the Vatican collection, in the Vatican palace. In other words, he was master of the Pope's seals. He kept the lead seals. Because he worked in Rome for a while, and he came under the influence of Michelangelo later. This painting probably dates from before that, when, clearly he's working together with Giorgione as a young man. He's picked up that same wonderful softness. This is very Italian, this softness. We'll see when we come to look at Spanish painting. Softness is not really a quality, but the softness and sweetness very much is an Italian quality. And if you look closely at the area of the nose and the moustache and the philtrum and the lips, it is conceived in oil with no hard outlines, with such delicacy. It's a very, very, very beautiful painting. Thankfully, the face has survived relatively well. There you can see the hat, which was there. Again, there's an extraordinary coincidence here. Another one with a hat that was removed at some point. And of course, again, cleaning there on the gown has taken away all the sort of beautiful furriness that it would have been achieved by the painter there. But it still is remarkable. He's a fine, fine technician. Another point, without even showing his face, you know who this is. We've moved to another gallery, but I just want to concentrate on this. Look at the quality of that by comparison with what we've just been talking about. There, that beautiful observation and delicate definition of the nose and the moustache and the lips. Great painter, we would say. What do we make of this then? I mean, this is a very great painter, but would we wholeheartedly say that kind of quality level of painting, done like that, and not with any kind of sense of, there's no sense of it actually being applied to the material, or where the sort of, where the light catches it, or whether it's a satiny material, or whether it's a cotton or a serge, or what kind of thing. It's very, very approximate. It's done sort of like that, as if sort of, I don't care about that. Because, of course, the painter didn't care about that. What he cared about was the face, which is done with extraordinary intensity. And intensity is going to be a keynote of Spanish painting. And of course here we're looking at one of the greatest Spanish painters of all time, Francisco de Goya, and a very great portrait of his done of the Duke of de la Roca, or Marquis of Safraga. He had lots and lots of titles. He was a bookish man, lots of books there. He was president of the Academy, of the sort of literary academy of Madrid, and a very distinguished and clearly very haughty and slightly frightening man. Because that face, this is what Goya doesn't, it's not because Goya can't do really good stuff here. He just doesn't want your eye even to look at that, though he's got to do it, because this guy is very self-important, and he wants you to know that he has the honor or the order of the Golden Fleece there, which was a very important order, and blah, 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 blah. So Goya dutifully, as a court painter, does it. But his heart is not in it. But his heart is in the face. And notice the mouth. Notice how Goya, in his portraits, generally goes straight to the mouth. And the mouth expresses an awful lot. And the fact it's slightly sort of, the upper lip is slightly curled. He's a combination of being slightly ridiculous, this figure, because of the sort of boings on the side of his head. There's a sort of, you feel so, oh gosh, what a git, when you look at it in a way. But on the other hand, he's also terrifying. Goya is wonderful at doing this. But there is a reason for it. This is painted in 1796. 4 years earlier, Goya had fallen terribly ill. He was a high-living person, high-octane, high-liver, and he contracted syphilis, and he had a terrible fever, and in 1792 was confined to bed for a long time. His letters reveal that he was very, very, very ill, and as a result of this illness, he emerged not hard of hearing, but stone deaf. Now, we're not talking about something similar to Beethoven, which is a gradual, decay of the hearing, backgrounds, or tinnitus and all that. Beethoven had a terrible problem, but he could still hear with a trumpet some of the time. Goya, stone deaf. The nerve had simply ceased to function. Now, he was in the middle of his career. He was only 40 years in his 40s, and he's stone deaf. Now that changes your life totally, and it changes your interaction with people. Just think what it means to be deaf. You close your eyes, you're still alive when you close your eyes because you can hear everything going on and you're aware. Your ears make you aware of what's going on behind you. You're in the center of a world that makes sound. As soon as that's cut off, you're right at the edge, because the reality for you is only what you see. And, month after month, year after year, deafness takes a terrible toll. You cease to, for us, when we're dreaming and sleeping and then you wake up, it's all quite clear, because you wake up and there's noise and all the rest. When you're sleeping, there isn't noise. So for us, if we have a bad dream, we wake up, we think, oh, thank God, that's all over. For a deaf person, stone deaf person, it's quite different, because there is no difference. The sleeping world, the world of dreams, and the real world are one and the same. None of them make any sound at all. So there's not a clear distinction. And of course, when you're deaf, you people react differently to deaf people. Some of them shout at deaf people. Some of them, more considerate, enunciate very clearly because they know their lips are being read. And so concentrating on the mouth is very, very important. And that's why I stress looking at the mouth, because Goya's only way of communicating at this point was looking at people's mouths to see what they were saying, and concentrating on their face and seeing the expression, because that was the only thing that could feed in to his understanding of what was going on with that person. And the other thing, of course, which has to be said about deafness is it is terribly isolating. You are incredibly lonely when you're very deaf. And Goya's letters, indicate that he had moments of panic, frustration. He wanted to shake the world to make it make some noise. But something of that solitary isolation comes out in his portraits generally. And here, he's not against a dark background or a background with anything. It's just a plain, blank, grey background. And that sort of isolation of the figure is very characteristically Goya. His figures seem more isolated than any because he felt this isolation. Just a few other images of Goya. I mean, some of you may know, these terrifying paintings that he produced at the end of his life called the Pinturas Negras, the black paintings, with which he decorated his dining room in the house that he lived in, which was known as the Quinto del Sordo, the deaf man's house. And they have these flying, floating beings in them, very, very often floating. Remember, this is a man who doesn't distinguish between the dream world and the real world, who, for us, the difference between a ghost and a person, if a person walks across the room, they make a noise. You feel their footfall. If a ghost goes across the room, it makes no sound. To a deaf person, it's all the same, ghost or so floating people appear in his paintings. And these magnificent portraits for which he's very famous are wonderful. I mean, they're always the face is the central, rightly, obviously, the center of our attention. But they're put on top of a long figure that is incredibly sort of isolated. This woman also had reason to be fairly isolated. She's called the Countess of Chinchon. She went mad. Clearly, Goya had a bit of a crush on her. He rather liked her. And she latterly, rather like sort of Hamlet's Ophelia, went off her head later. But something of that battiness you can see in her face, because you can read everything about people in Goya's paintings. And then the rather terrifying Marchesa della Solana there. But notice these full-length, very, very isolated figures against a completely sort of featureless background. Very, very Goya. So his personal history, it's very important in looking at Goya to understand this personal history and to imagine what it was like to be deaf. Okay, let's go back to our Renaissance world again. I said a moment ago about the Giorgione painting that because of the question of provenance there, this big, big gap in provenance in which we don't know where the painting was, could induce skepticism in us. It doesn't in my case because I personally feel it's very, very sort of essentially Giorgione. Looking at the 15 or so other paintings by Giorgione in the world, they seem all of a body. The only painting in the collection upstairs which really does worry me is this one, which is one of the favourites because, heaven's sake, it's a lovely painting. It's absolutely beautiful, known as the Madonna of the Roses. It's been attributed to a guy called Pseudo Pier Francesco Toscano, or Pseudo Pier Francesco di Firenze, or I can't remember his exact title. So he's a sort of portmanteau name for basically a sort of group of paintings. Something worrying there. But as I look at that and look at the quality, it's a lovely picture, of this Madonna and child again, a little boy clutching a bird and roses in the background. It's a very sweet painting. But it's somehow without personality. It doesn't speak to me the personality of a painter. It's extraordinarily anodyne. It's like a placebo tablet in some way. And I don't know, the face of the baby. Remember the little face of the Crivelli, the sort of, with the sort of pearls around his neck. okay, not necessarily more beautiful than that, but terribly memorable. I mean, there's the individuality of the painter there. And I think probably most worrying, I find the sort of slightly plastic and wooden sort of roses, a bit like wallpaper, actually. And this, the sort of eyes, it's all very, very, the sort of ear, I don't know, it's just very, it's without sort of real character. And it's very convenient that you have upstairs, in the same gallery, a really great late Gothic, early Renaissance painting by a Sienese painter called Giovanni di Paolo, which ostensibly is very similar, because there's a Virgin and baby Jesus, down at the bottom there, and all those roses. But look at the roses. I mean, here's a painter who really knows how to paint. I mean, look at those beautiful Gothic roses, like out of a tapestry, all, You see what I mean about the ones before being slightly sort of like plastic roses that are sort of in wallpaper? Giovanni di Paolo is a great painter. He doesn't know how to do perspective and things like that. He was Sienese, after all. They sort of didn't do perspective. But he's very memorable. And his Virgin is not more beautiful at all, but she shouts Giovanni di Paolo. And these sort of strange angels with their funny sort of locks that look like they've just sort of washed their hair and not quite sort of dried it properly yet. I mean, they're slightly odd faces. Yes, they're not pretty faces, but they're really Giovanni di Paolo. I mean, they're very, very much, and all these kind of techniques. You see that technique of the gown there? What's happened there? This is very typical of Giovanni di Paolo and the person that he studied with and painted with, who was a painter, Sienese painter called Sassetta. And Sassetta sort of really patented this method, which was to gild the whole of that area there. So if you go underneath the red paint, you've got solid gold leaf painting. Then the red, this lovely rose madder red and white, is painted over the top. And then with a sharp instrument, he just goes, makes little incisions in it to take away the paint and reveal the gold underneath, to give the impression of satin, sort of shining satin. When you see the painting itself upstairs, you'll see what I mean. In the image, it doesn't quite come out very well, and obviously, it's time has taken its toll here. But that was the idea. Well, that's very, very different from that. Very, as I say, completely sort of plastic. I don't feel a Renaissance individual behind that, or really a great painter behind that. And though it is a lovely painter, I don't know. Again, I'll be watching that space. I'll be very interested to know what the curator was going to say about this painting. I don't know anything about its provenance. Maybe it is. I mean, I don't know. But I just, again, the ears. I mean, look at this sort of ear. It doesn't sort of convince me as an early Renaissance ear. And then this bird here. I mean, Jesus is always seen with a goldfinch. A goldfinch is terribly important. Because it's a symbol of the crucifixion, because the goldfinch has a great red band here, and it was supposed to have been splashed with some of the blood from Christ on the cross, and therefore kept this red colour. Okay, well this is not a goldfinch, it's a swallow. And there's no reason on earth why a painter doesn't have the right to show the Virgin and Child, and the child holding a swallow. But he's the only one that I know of in the whole history of painting who does use a swallow instead of a goldfinch. So there is a goldfinch down below, actually. I can't remember whether, I don't think I've got a picture of it right down at the bottom of the painting, but not a very good, just look at the quality of it when you go upstairs with Mona and Tony afterwards. I mean, just look at the quality of that goldfinch. So, a lovely sort of picture, but kind of wallpaper for me. I don't know what really to make of it. There's the Giovanni di Paolo's goldfinch. Again, it's not a sort of not the kind of goldfinch you would expect to find in Audubon's birds or whatever. But it's clearly a goldfinch because it's got that red spot there, which is its reason for being in the painting. Idiosyncrasy, generally. That was a highly idiosyncratic painting. Giovanni di Paolo is idiosyncratic, and that's how we know it really is. Nobody can pretend to be Giovanni di Paolo. He is just an idiosyncratic painter, and wonderfully recognizable like that. So also is El Greco, and here we are again back in the Spanish world, again a generation, 2 generations later than any of the painters that we've been looking at, with the exception of Goya. The reason for El Greco's idiosyncrasy and eccentricity as a painter, and unusual as an individuality as a painter, is sort of embedded in his life story, because he's a Greek originally. I mean, he comes from Crete. He was born in Candia, the Venetian town of Candia today, called Heraklion on Crete, and he trained as an icon painter. And his name was Domenikos Theotokopoulos. And he was born in the 1540s, and he left Crete as a 19-year-old in 1560 and went to Venice. So here was somebody who trained to paint icons. And he goes to the capital, commercial capital of the world, the richest city in the world in 1560. That's what Venice was, with these magnificent painters, Titian, Tintoretto, all that kind of thing. And he's, as a sensitive person and with a visual eye, bowled over by what Titian can do. All this sort of fluid brushwork and the wonderfully expressive poses and all the rest. And he stays there a while. He goes to Rome in 1570, sees Michelangelo's work there, sees the Sistine Chapel, is profoundly influenced by that. And then in 1574, he migrates again to Spain, where he spends the rest of his life and dies as a very distinguished painter in Toledo in Spain. So he's made a journey right across the Mediterranean. He is really the most Mediterranean of all painters, because he's born in the East, in the Byzantine world of Crete. He had his education in Italy, in Venice, the most important then city, richest city in the world, and one of the most important artistic centres. He also went to Rome and felt very much the influence of Michelangelo's work. And then he goes to this other end of the Mediterranean, the Iberian Peninsula, the counter-Reformation, very different world of Spain. And he bridges them all. And that explains why his art is highly individual, because it's a very, very odd story. Apologies for the picture. The icon is in fact behind glass in a church on the island of Syros, which is why it's rather difficult to get a picture of it. But this is the earliest signed painting by Domenikos Theotokopoulos, El Greco. It's in the church of the Dormition of the Virgin in Syros, in the Aegean, and there it is. That's how he started life. I mean, how different, how utterly, utterly different from what we see later. Well, the style that he creates is extraordinarily individual. El Greco's paintings were not appreciated after his death at all. In fact, they were not really known in the West until 1830, when Napoleon shipped lots of Spanish painting to Paris during the wars between France and Spain, Napoleonic Wars. And at that point, when the French painters saw El Greco, they realized that he was a great painter, and his reputation was sort of made forever, really. But up until then, he was not really appreciated, because he is a highly individual character. Just notice here, you'll see this when you go upstairs to the gallery. If you follow the red line there, okay, you'll see that there is a difference in the paint surface there between that area, this area of the face, and that area there. Difficult to know quite why that may be, except that a painter like El Greco had a lot of commissions. He had a lot of students. He delegated work to assistants. He often didn't have the time to finish paintings himself. And so if that were the case, he probably would dedicate himself principally to the marvelously important central bit, in other words, the face of this penitent St. Peter, who is repenting of having denied Christ 3 times and realized what a rotter he's been. So it's a wonderfully empathetic face. And he may have done that and left the rest of the painting, which is of a decidedly inferior quality, to his assistants. And if you go down the painting and look at his arms and his hands, and particularly his hands and fingernails, it's done far more cursively and with much less. I mean, look at that as a definition of an arm by comparison with that magnificent face. And that area of difference in the paint, surface of the paint there, would suggest to me that this area here is El Greco and the rest has largely been finished by assistants, because there is a big fall in quality there. But there is an intensity about El Greco's paintings, which is, which is unique. An intensity, it seems to me, the key to understanding Spanish painting. I mean, unlike that sort of softness and accessibility, an instant appeal which Italian painting has, Spanish, the strange world of the Counter-Reformation, the world of the Inquisition, a very, very different country in a very different landscape. You know, remember, landscape's very important for forming the way painters paint. Italy is full of, valleys and forests and mountains and rivers. Most of central Castile and central Spain is like the Syrian desert. It's not a soft landscape at all. And the Spaniards are a product of that very, very different landscape. And the intensity with which things are perceived, the intensity of that empathy in the face of St. Peter, and the intensity of this kind of vision, another of your great treasures here, Sanchez Cotan's still life there, is quintessentially Spanish. Now, there are lots of ways of looking at this painting. We've talked about the significance of fruits and vegetables in talking about Crivelli at the beginning. And in a religious context, there's nothing to stop one reading this as a religious painting. I don't know whether that's the right way or not, but it's certainly interesting, this arch, which begins up at the top with, guess what, a quince again. And then this hanging cabbage. Don't be put off by the fact that they're hanging. In an age before refrigerators, it was one of the ways of preserving fruit and preserving vegetables, so that they were constantly in the air and not in contact with one another. So you hung them in a larder by pieces of string like that, because you couldn't sort of, preserve things in a fridge. And then the melon cut open, and then, guess what? Our old friend the cucumber again. The quince. Do you remember what we were saying? It has that sort of form of the pregnant womb. It's the symbol of fertility, of birth. You plant a quince tree to give thanks for the safe birth of a child. The cabbage, the vegetable. There's a lovely poem by Andrew Marvell called The Coy Mistress. If we had but welled enough in time, dear lady, this coyness were no crime. He talks about our vegetable growth growing bigger than continents. He's talking about, in other words, the love of him and his mistress, which he calls a vegetable love. Vegetable means growing. It means the act of coming to maturity. And so the cabbage, after the birth, becomes the symbol of growth and coming to maturity. Then, wow, full ripeness. But inherent in the ripeness is the cutting and the end. And the seeds, and then, of course, we talked about this symbol of resurrection. Those seeds become, this is a fruit which has dozens and dozens, thousands of seeds inside it, as does the melon. So in a way, maybe it's pushing it, maybe it's not, maybe it was nothing to do with what Sanchez Cotan, or maybe it was. He was a profoundly religious painter, and in fact, he gave up his life as a painter, well, not as a painter, but he gave up his lay life and then joined a Carthusian monastery in Granada and died in Granada later in his life. So, I mean, he was a highly religious person. So it's not impossible that there is a sort of allegory there, maybe associated to the life of Christ or not. But that's one way of looking at it. But the intensity with which that is seen against this dark background is extraordinary. And this painting dates from 1602. It's the period in which Caravaggio is doing his extraordinary chiaroscuro, as they're called, paintings, these paintings of brightly illuminated individuals against dark, dark backgrounds that are profoundly arresting, just as this is. Now, Sanchez Cotan is in Spain and Caravaggio is in Italy, and it seems to me highly unlikely that Sanchez Cotan ever saw a painting by Caravaggio. But he almost certainly had access to the scientific and optical experiments to which Caravaggio was also had access. Because Sanchez Cotan worked in the Escorial Palace, and the Escorial Palace was a place where courtiers, particularly the men of letters, the men of science, would have been around, and all the rage. I mean, Europe was taken in the 1590s and early 1600s by this rage of enthusiasm for optical experiments, creating camera obscuras, mirrors, lenses. We know that Caravaggio had lenses and curtains in his room for doing kind of camera obscura experiments. And this kind of effect, this kind of intensity of looking at brilliantly illuminated objects against a dark background is really only possible if you're working with a projected image in a camera obscura. In other words, the objects are outside in brilliant sunshine. They're projected through a lens onto a white surface, which gives you your basis for painting. And when you do that, they don't appear against a bright background. The lens filters out all the rest of the light, and they appear against a dark, dark, dark background, just as in a painting by Caravaggio. So it's not impossible. I mean, heaven knows whether there's any way of proving this, but that he could have understood some of the optical experiments that were going on through his contacts in the Escorial. Not necessarily actually seeing works by Italian masters like Caravaggio, which are being painted at exactly the same time. It's, just to give you an idea of the intensity of it, here's from a different culture, but a not distant century. This is the 17th century Japanese watermelon. A wonderful picture, beautifully Japanese, marvelously suggestive, marvelously minimalist, but certainly without that intensity which is characteristic of Sanchez Cotan, a study of fruit, which is an entirely different sort of axis, a different dimension. And just while we're in Japan, some of you may have been to Washington last year when this marvelous exhibition called Colorful Realm of Japanese court paintings by the court painter from Kyoto was on display. Someone who observed nature extraordinarily finely. Look at those wonderful fish there. Marvelous studies of fish. But notice how they're sort of disjointed. There's that fish, and that fish, and that fish, and each one is a perfect sort of study, but they're not united by a common sort of water and as if they were all seen together. They're not unified by any light. They're seen sort of almost abstractly of light, as if they were plates in an encyclopedia. Even when you look at them close to, very, very finely done on silk, but not with any sense of the suffusion of light. Whereas when we come back to Sanchez Cotan, the crucial thing is not the actual detail with which he's described them, though that is remarkable. It's this extraordinary light which binds them together and gives one the sense of, it takes your breath away, that they really are there, sort of in the sunshine. You feel it quite differently from those Japanese paintings I've just shown you. And that effect is achieved by, for the artist, by using optical means like the camera obscura, in other words, the darkened chamber into which you project a brightly illuminated scene from outside. Well, I'll finish with the artist with the last letter in the alphabet, Surburan, and this marvelous piece which encapsulates that intensity in yet another dimension. Look at that. Of all the ways in which people have talked about and painters have talked about the sacrifice, the religious painters have talked about the religious sacrifice of Jesus, I mean the sacrifice that Jesus Christ makes as the Redeemer for the Christian view of the world. None is more direct, more intense, more pertinent, more minimalist than that. I remember that Crivelli painting was talking about it, the apples and the flies and all those are talking around that same subject. But underneath this painting is this little inscription which says, Tamquam Agnus Dei, as a lamb of God. So as a lamb, so obviously Jesus sacrificed himself. And, the placidity, the extraordinary asymmetry of it as well. The fact that it's all sort of hunched up, poor little animal to the right with its neck out. It's an extraordinarily intense image on a spiritual level and as a vision. And he's obviously, though a generation later, has followed what Sanchez Cotan was doing. And he in turn experimented himself with what we call bodegones, which are these still lives. This is in the Norton Simon Museum, just up the road in LA, a wonderful collection there. Another painting by Zurbarán, a still life which makes us think again of the painting by Sanchez Cotan. This is not a cup of coffee, but a glass of water there on the right. And the flower and the fruit. What a different way of looking at fruit from how we began with Crivelli and the sort of the symbolic idea enshrined in fruit. This is simply a celebration of looking and intensity. And, painters like this, great painters like Zurbarán, teach us how to look. And that's what we do all the time with photography. That's what I did with that. It's just another way of looking. We're back where we began. But, notice how when we see things, we see them against a luminous background, and the camera sees it the same. But when you project the image into a camera obscura and onto a screen, everything appears against a black background, which gives it this wonderful intensity. Well, since we're back where we began, I'll finish, and thank you very much indeed for your. Somebody's going to ask me what that second thing is. Okay. It's funny how your mind goes. It's a terribly important thing, and your mind goes completely blank. Let me have a look. I did have it. No, I don't think I even have it on a piece of paper. We began by talking about just seeing a few paintings. And I remember what it was. It was simply that we, yes, I'd said that we look at paintings now differently because we're bombarded with images all the time. Cinemas, televisions, magazines, books, and people then only saw very few images in their life. That's why these pictures have such intensity and why we do them a service by talking about them in such depth. But we also need to remember, and this was really in the second point, which follows on from that, is the setting in which these paintings were often seen. Obviously a gallery can't, a museum like this can't do anything else. The pictures are under uniform light, they're spread-eagled against the wall, they're one next to another. In a way, it's like going to a hospital, and in this bed there's this patient, and in that bed there's that patient, and there's this painting and that painting, and they're all different, but they're all out of the context in which they were originally seen. And those little tiny, the ones that suffer most are those little tiny altarpieces at the beginning, the Fra Angelico and the Maso di Banco, those little altarpieces, because they look so. They look like sort of poor little sort of butterflies pinned, in a case, in this bright light. Whereas, of course, they would have been seen as the focus of attention in a dark, rural chapel with candles in front of them. And it's important for us to recreate, and that was really the point I wanted to make, was just to recreate the settings in which these paintings were. It's very important not to, we tend, because of books, because of galleries, always to take paintings out of the context in which they were created. And, you know, it's very important, you know, I'm always saying this to students about the Sistine Chapel, because they ask invariably about the cleaning of the Sistine Chapel and the great debate, and whether James Beck was right that the restorers destroyed, you know, and whether Michelangelo was painting in bright colours or light colours, until you go to the Sistine Chapel and you switch the lights out and you see how dark that chapel is. You don't understand why Michelangelo painted in such bright colours. So when you see reproductions of Michelangelo, which are taken with bright reflector lights to make the photograph available, it's completely changing the appearance of Michelangelo, who's a not insignificant painter. And so, you know, whether we're talking about a great painter like Michelangelo or the humble little altarpiece painters upstairs, it's the same thing. We need to, in our minds, recreate how these things were originally seen. What were their original circumstances? That was all it was. Sorry, say now. Thank you.